Question 1. The assessment process reveals a candidate's proposed solution for analyzing user engagement data to improve a new software feature. The candidate suggests directly accessing and analyzing individual user activity logs, which contain personally identifiable information, PI, to identify patterns of feature usage and potential pain points. Which of the following approaches best aligns with data privacy, best practices, and regulatory expectations for handling user data? Option A. Anonymize and aggregate the user engagement data to identify broad trends and common issues before conducting any analysis, ensuring individual user identities are not revealed. Option B. Share the raw, identifiable user activity logs with a third-party analytics firm for analysis, assuming they have their own privacy protocols. Option C. Obtain explicit consent from each user for the specific analysis of their individual activity logs before proceeding. Option D. Proceed with analyzing the raw, identifiable user activity logs, as the privacy policy broadly covers data usage for service improvement. The correct answer is A. Anonymize and aggregate the user engagement data to identify broad trends and common issues before conducting any analysis, ensuring individual user identities are not revealed. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a candidate's understanding of data privacy principles, a critical area for any technology professional. The scenario presents a common challenge, balancing the need for data analysis to improve services with the imperative to protect user privacy. This requires careful judgment to ensure compliance with relevant regulations and ethical standards. The correct approach demonstrates a commitment to privacy by design and adherence to data minimization principles. It prioritizes anonymization and aggregation of data before analysis, directly aligning with the spirit and letter of data protection laws that mandate processing only necessary data and protecting individuals' identities. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of data breaches and unauthorized access, fostering user trust and maintaining legal compliance. An incorrect approach that proceeds with analysis on identifiable personal data without explicit consent or a clear legal basis fails to uphold data protection principles. This could lead to violations of privacy regulations, resulting in significant fines, reputational damage, and loss of user confidence. Another incorrect approach, which relies solely on a general privacy policy without specific consent for the intended analysis, is insufficient. Modern data protection frameworks often require granular consent for specific data processing activities, especially when that data is used for purposes beyond the initial collection. A third incorrect approach, which involves sharing raw, identifiable data with third parties without proper safeguards or consent, represents a severe breach of trust and a direct violation of data protection laws, exposing both the individual and the organization to substantial risks. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the specific data processing activity and its purpose. They must then assess the legal basis for this processing, considering consent, legitimate interest, or contractual necessity. Crucially, they should evaluate the necessity and proportionality of the data being processed, always striving for the least intrusive method. Implementing robust anonymization and aggregation techniques, obtaining explicit consent where required, and conducting regular privacy impact assessments are essential steps in ensuring ethical and compliant data handling. Question 2. The assessment process reveals that a product team wishes to analyze user interaction data to identify trends and improve feature development. The data contains personally identifiable information. What is the most compliant and ethically sound approach to enable this analysis while respecting user privacy? Option A. Obtain broad, general consent from all users for any future data analysis, regardless of specific purpose. Option B. Anonymize and aggregate the user interaction data to remove any personally identifiable information before conducting the analysis. Option C. Repurpose the data for analysis without further privacy considerations, assuming the initial data collection was for a related purpose. Option D. Proceed with the analysis using the raw data, relying on existing internal access controls to protect user privacy. The correct answer is B. Anonymize and aggregate the user interaction data to remove any personally identifiable information before conducting the analysis. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to data privacy and compliance within a technology company. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for data analysis to improve product offerings with the stringent requirements of data protection regulations. Misinterpreting or overlooking these regulations can lead to severe legal penalties, reputational damage, and loss of customer trust. The professional must exercise careful judgment to ensure all data handling practices are compliant. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding and application of data privacy principles, specifically focusing on anonymization and aggregation techniques before data is used for analysis. This aligns with the spirit and letter of data protection laws, which aim to prevent the identification of individuals. By anonymizing data, the risk of re-identification is minimized, thereby respecting individual privacy rights. Aggregating data further obscures individual contributions, making it suitable for trend analysis without compromising personal information. This proactive approach demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical data stewardship. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with data analysis without any form of anonymization or aggregation, assuming that internal access controls are sufficient. This fails to meet the fundamental requirements of data protection regulations, which often mandate de-identification of personal data before it can be processed for secondary purposes. Internal access controls, while important for security, do not negate the need for privacy-preserving techniques. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on obtaining broad consent from users for all potential future data uses, without clearly defining the scope and purpose of data processing. While consent is a crucial element of data privacy, it must be informed, specific, and freely given. Overly broad or vague consent clauses can be deemed invalid by regulatory bodies, leaving the company exposed to non-compliance. Furthermore, even with consent, the principle of data minimization and purpose limitation should still be applied. A third incorrect approach is to assume that data collected for one specific purpose can be freely repurposed for any other analytical need, without re-evaluating the privacy implications and obtaining appropriate legal basis or consent. Regulations typically require data to be processed for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes, and any deviation from these purposes necessitates a new legal basis or consent. Professional reasoning. Professionals in technology roles must adopt a privacy by design and privacy by default mindset. This means integrating data protection considerations into every stage of product development and data processing. When faced with data analysis needs, the decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying the type of data involved and whether it constitutes personal data. 2. Determining the legal basis for processing this data for the intended analytical purpose. 3. Implementing appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect data privacy, such as anonymization, pseudonymization, or aggregation, prioritizing the least intrusive methods. 4. Ensuring transparency with users about data collection and usage. 5. Regularly reviewing and updating data handling practices to align with evolving regulations and best practices. Question 3. Market research demonstrates a significant opportunity to enhance user engagement by introducing a new feature that leverages user interaction data to personalize content recommendations in real time. This feature would involve collecting and analyzing granular user behavior patterns. What is the most responsible approach to developing and deploying this feature, considering the need for regulatory compliance and ethical data handling? Option A. Conduct a thorough privacy and security impact assessment, engaging legal and compliance teams early in the development process to identify and mitigate potential risks before deployment. Option B. Prioritize rapid deployment to capture market advantage, conducting a post-deployment review of data handling practices to ensure compliance. Option C. Implement the feature using anonymized data only, without a specific assessment of how this anonymization process itself adheres to data protection standards. Option D. Proceed with development and deployment, assuming existing general data privacy policies are sufficient to cover the new feature's data handling practices. The correct answer is D. Proceed with development and deployment, assuming existing general data privacy policies are sufficient to cover the new feature's data handling practices. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for innovation and market competitiveness with the stringent requirements of regulatory compliance, specifically concerning data privacy and security. The core difficulty lies in understanding and applying the Microsoft hiring assessment test's implied regulatory framework, which, for the purpose of this exam, we will assume aligns with general principles of data protection and ethical AI development as often seen in global tech environments, without referencing specific, named regulations from any single jurisdiction. The challenge is to ensure that any new feature, even one designed for competitive advantage, does not inadvertently expose user data or violate privacy expectations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, risk-based assessment of the proposed feature's impact on user privacy and data security before deployment. This involves engaging with legal and compliance teams early in the development lifecycle. This proactive stance ensures that potential regulatory pitfalls are identified and mitigated, aligning with the ethical imperative to protect user data and maintain trust. It demonstrates a commitment to responsible innovation, where business objectives are pursued within a framework of legal and ethical boundaries. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the feature without a comprehensive privacy and security review fails to uphold the fundamental duty of care owed to users. This constitutes a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Such an approach risks violating data protection principles, potentially leading to severe legal penalties, reputational damage, and a loss of customer trust. It prioritizes speed to market over user safety and compliance, which is professionally unacceptable. Another incorrect approach, which is to assume that existing general data protection policies are sufficient without specific analysis for the new feature, is also professionally unsound. While existing policies provide a baseline, novel features often introduce unique data handling scenarios that may not be adequately covered. This oversight can lead to unintended breaches or noncompliance, as it lacks the specificity required for a thorough risk assessment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the core business objective and the proposed technical solution. 2. Proactively engage legal, compliance, and security teams to understand potential regulatory implications and risks associated with the proposed solution, particularly concerning data handling. 3. Conduct a detailed privacy and security impact assessment for the specific feature, considering how user data will be collected, stored, processed, and protected. 4. Develop and implement mitigation strategies for any identified risks, ensuring alignment with relevant data protection principles and ethical guidelines. 5. Obtain necessary approvals from legal and compliance before proceeding with deployment. 6. Establish ongoing monitoring and review mechanisms to ensure continued compliance post-deployment. Question 4. The evaluation methodology shows that a new feature being developed for a cloud service platform has the potential to collect and process user data in a manner not explicitly detailed in current data privacy policies. The team is considering how to proceed with development and deployment. Option A. Implement the feature as designed, and then address any compliance issues that may arise after the feature is live and in use. Option B. Develop the feature with minimal data collection, and then expand data collection capabilities if user feedback indicates a need, without a formal compliance review for the expansion. Option C. Proceed with development, assuming that if the data processing is not explicitly forbidden by current regulations or internal policies, it is permissible. Option D. Halt development until a comprehensive legal review can be conducted to assess all potential compliance implications, even if it delays the launch. The correct answer is C. Proceed with development, assuming that if the data processing is not explicitly forbidden by current regulations or internal policies, it is permissible. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in regulatory compliance, balancing innovation with adherence to established guidelines. The professional challenge lies in interpreting and applying broad compliance principles to a novel technological implementation, where explicit guidance may be lacking. This requires careful judgment to ensure that the spirit of the regulations is upheld, even if the letter is not directly addressed by existing rules. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a proactive and thorough assessment of potential risks and compliance gaps. By engaging with legal and compliance experts early, and by documenting the decision-making process, the team demonstrates a commitment to responsible innovation. This aligns with the ethical obligation to act with due diligence and to protect both the company and its users from potential harm or regulatory penalties. It also fosters a culture of compliance within the organization. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the absence of explicit prohibitions fails to acknowledge the underlying intent of regulatory frameworks, which is to prevent harm and ensure fair practices. This oversight can lead to significant legal and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that relies on a superficial interpretation of existing policies without considering the specific context of the new technology risks overlooking critical compliance issues. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adapt to evolving technological landscapes. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes speed to market over thorough compliance analysis is ethically unsound and exposes the organization to substantial risks, including fines, lawsuits, and loss of customer trust. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment, consultation with subject matter experts, legal, compliance, security, a clear understanding of the regulatory intent, and robust documentation of all decisions and justifications. When faced with ambiguity, erring on the side of caution and seeking expert guidance is paramount. Question 5. Governance review demonstrates that a new feature for a cloud-based productivity suite is being developed rapidly to meet market demand. However, the development team has not yet consulted with the legal and compliance departments regarding data handling and user privacy implications, specific to the Microsoft hiring assessment tests implied regulatory framework. Which of the following actions best addresses this situation? Option A. Immediately halt development of the new feature until a comprehensive review by legal and compliance is completed and all identified requirements are integrated into the design. Option B. Continue development but instruct the team to make a note of any potential privacy issues to be reviewed at a later stage. Option C. Proceed with development as planned, assuming that standard privacy settings will suffice, and address any specific compliance concerns after the feature is launched. Option D. Delegate the responsibility of compliance to the marketing team to ensure the feature's messaging aligns with potential regulatory needs. The correct answer is A. Immediately halt development of the new feature until a comprehensive review by legal and compliance is completed and all identified requirements are integrated into the design. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for a new feature with the long-term implications of regulatory compliance and data privacy. The pressure to deliver quickly can lead to shortcuts that compromise security and legal obligations. Careful judgment is required to ensure that innovation does not come at the expense of trust and adherence to established frameworks. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough assessment of regulatory requirements before development begins. This proactive stance ensures that the new feature is designed with compliance in mind from the outset, minimizing the risk of costly rework or legal repercussions. Specifically, adhering to the Microsoft hiring assessment tests implied regulatory framework, which would typically align with general data protection principles and software development best practices, means understanding data handling, user consent, and security protocols. Integrating compliance checks early is a fundamental aspect of responsible product development and demonstrates a commitment to ethical data stewardship. An incorrect approach that proceeds without understanding the regulatory landscape is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for legal and ethical obligations, potentially leading to breaches of data privacy laws, loss of customer trust, and significant financial penalties. Another incorrect approach, which involves attempting to retroactively address compliance issues, is also flawed. This reactive strategy is inefficient, often incomplete, and carries a higher risk of overlooking critical requirements. It suggests a lack of foresight and a failure to embed compliance into the core development lifecycle, which is a hallmark of professional negligence in regulated environments. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant regulatory obligations for the product or feature being developed. This involves consulting legal and compliance teams, reviewing internal policies, and understanding industry-specific mandates. Once identified, these requirements should be translated into actionable development guidelines and integrated into the project plan. Regular checkpoints for compliance throughout the development lifecycle, rather than a single post-development review, are crucial for ensuring ongoing adherence and mitigating risks. Question 6. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of unusual data ingress from an external source that deviates from established baseline activity, raising concerns about potential data integrity and unauthorized access. Option A. Adjust the monitoring system's thresholds to exclude the observed pattern, assuming it represents a benign, albeit unusual, operational change. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive forensic analysis of the system logs and data flows associated with the anomalous ingress, correlating timestamps and source identifiers to pinpoint the exact nature and origin of the deviation, and document all findings meticulously. Option C. Immediately disconnect the affected system from the network to prevent any further potential data compromise, without undertaking an immediate analysis of the anomaly's characteristics. Option D. Escalate the alert to a senior management team for a high-level decision on system shutdown, deferring detailed technical investigation until a directive is received. Correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive forensic analysis of the system logs and data flows associated with the anomalous ingress, correlating timestamps and source identifiers to pinpoint the exact nature and origin of the deviation, and document all findings meticulously. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficient data processing with the stringent requirements of regulatory compliance, specifically concerning data privacy and integrity. The monitoring system's demonstration of potential anomalies necessitates a proactive and thorough investigation to ensure that no regulatory breaches have occurred or are imminent. The core of the challenge lies in accurately identifying the nature of the anomaly and its potential impact on regulated data, without causing undue disruption or compromising sensitive information. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, evidence-based investigation that aligns with regulatory expectations for data handling and security. By initiating a detailed review of the system logs and data flows, the team is directly addressing the observed anomaly in a manner that allows for precise identification of the root cause and any potential regulatory implications. This methodical approach ensures that any remediation efforts are targeted and effective, minimizing the risk of future incidents and demonstrating a commitment to compliance. This aligns with principles of data governance and risk management expected under relevant regulatory frameworks, such as those governing data protection and financial reporting integrity. An incorrect approach that involves immediately disabling the system without a proper investigation would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action, while seemingly decisive, bypasses the critical step of understanding the anomaly's nature and scope. It could lead to the loss of crucial audit trails, hinder the identification of a genuine security threat or compliance issue, and potentially violate regulations that mandate the maintenance of operational systems and the investigation of anomalies. Furthermore, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adhere to established incident response protocols. Another incorrect approach, such as relying solely on automated alerts without human oversight or deeper analysis, would also be a regulatory and ethical failure. Automated systems can generate false positives or miss subtle but significant deviations. Failure to conduct a thorough human-led investigation means that the underlying cause of the anomaly might remain undiscovered, leaving the organization vulnerable to ongoing compliance risks or security breaches. This approach neglects the professional responsibility to critically evaluate system outputs and ensure the integrity of regulated data. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a structured incident response framework. This typically includes detection and reporting of the anomaly, initial assessment of its severity and potential impact, detailed investigation and analysis, containment and remediation of the issue, and post-incident review and documentation. Professionals must always prioritize understanding the what, why, and how of any anomaly before taking decisive action, ensuring that all steps taken are justifiable, documented, and in line with applicable laws, regulations, and ethical standards. This iterative process of investigation and informed decision-making is crucial for maintaining regulatory compliance and organizational integrity. Question 7. The control framework reveals a new software feature is nearing its release deadline, but the development team has not yet completed the formal documentation and validation required to demonstrate compliance with industry-specific data privacy regulations. The team lead is considering proceeding with the release and addressing the documentation gaps post-launch to meet the aggressive timeline. Option A. Proceed with the release, prioritizing the timeline, and initiate the documentation and validation process immediately after launch, treating any identified compliance issues as urgent post-release fixes. Option B. Proceed with the release, relying on informal internal discussions and team consensus to confirm compliance, with a plan to retroactively create documentation if issues arise. Option C. Halt the release until all required documentation and validation for the new feature are fully completed and approved, ensuring full compliance before market introduction. Option D. Delegate the responsibility of compliance documentation to a junior team member with the understanding that it can be completed concurrently with user feedback collection post-launch. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the release, prioritizing the timeline, and initiate the documentation and validation process immediately after launch, treating any identified compliance issues as urgent post-release fixes. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between rapid product development and the imperative of regulatory compliance. The pressure to innovate and release new features quickly can sometimes lead to overlooking or deprioritizing the rigorous documentation and validation required by regulatory bodies. This is particularly true in the technology sector, where the pace of change is high. Careful judgment is required to balance business objectives with legal and ethical obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a proactive and integrated compliance strategy. By embedding regulatory considerations into the design and development lifecycle from the outset, the organization minimizes the risk of non-compliance, which can lead to significant fines, reputational damage, and product recalls. This approach aligns with the principles of responsible innovation and demonstrates a commitment to ethical business conduct. Specifically, it adheres to the spirit of regulations that mandate due diligence and risk management in product development. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on post-release patching for compliance issues is professionally unacceptable. This reactive strategy is inherently risky and inefficient. It fails to address potential vulnerabilities or non-compliance from the design phase, leading to a higher likelihood of significant breaches. Such an approach can be seen as a disregard for regulatory intent, which is to prevent harm and ensure product safety and integrity before market entry. It also creates a culture where compliance is an afterthought, rather than a core value. Another incorrect approach that relies on informal internal discussions and anecdotal evidence for compliance validation is also professionally unacceptable. This method lacks the rigor and auditable trail required by most regulatory frameworks. It is subjective, prone to bias, and does not provide the objective evidence needed to demonstrate compliance to regulators or during audits. This can lead to unintentional noncompliance and a failure to identify critical risks. The professional reasoning process for such situations should involve a multi-stakeholder approach. First, clearly understand the applicable regulatory requirements for the product and its intended market. Second, integrate compliance checkpoints into the product development lifecycle, involving legal, compliance, and engineering teams. Third, establish clear documentation and validation procedures that are auditable. Fourth, conduct regular risk assessments and internal audits to identify and mitigate potential compliance gaps. Finally, foster a culture where compliance is understood as a shared responsibility, not solely the domain of a specific department. Question 8. The control framework reveals that a new AI-powered feature is being developed with a tight deadline, and the team is considering deferring a comprehensive data privacy impact assessment until after the initial launch to expedite release. Option A. Rely on the legal department to conduct a post-launch review to identify any potential compliance gaps, allowing the development team to focus solely on feature functionality. Option B. Implement basic data anonymization techniques and proceed with the launch, planning to address more complex privacy concerns in subsequent updates. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive data privacy impact assessment as an integral part of the development lifecycle, ensuring all identified risks are addressed prior to launch. Option D. Proceed with the launch and schedule the data privacy impact assessment for a later review, assuming existing general data protection policies are sufficient. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive data privacy impact assessment as an integral part of the development lifecycle, ensuring all identified risks are addressed prior to launch. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between rapid product development and the imperative of maintaining robust regulatory compliance. The pressure to innovate and release new features quickly can sometimes lead to overlooking or deprioritizing established control frameworks, especially when those controls are perceived as slowing down the development cycle. Careful judgment is required to balance the business need for speed with the legal and ethical obligations to protect user data and ensure system integrity. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a proactive and integrated strategy for regulatory compliance. By embedding compliance considerations into the design and development lifecycle from the outset, rather than treating it as an afterthought, organizations can mitigate risks more effectively and efficiently. This aligns with the principles of privacy by design and security by design, which are increasingly mandated or strongly encouraged by regulatory bodies. Specifically, for a Microsoft hiring assessment test, this implies adherence to internal Microsoft policies and relevant industry standards that govern data handling, security, and ethical AI development, ensuring that all products meet or exceed these requirements before deployment. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on post-deployment patching or reactive measures fails to meet regulatory expectations. Such an approach creates significant exposure to data breaches, privacy violations, and potential legal penalties, demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the principle of continuous compliance. Another incorrect approach, which relies on the assumption that existing, unverified controls are sufficient, is equally problematic. This overlooks the dynamic nature of regulatory landscapes and the evolving threat environment. It can lead to non-compliance due to outdated or inadequate controls, exposing the organization to reputational damage and legal repercussions. A third incorrect approach, which delegates compliance responsibility entirely to a separate team without clear integration or accountability within the development process, fosters a siloed and ineffective compliance culture. This can result in miscommunication, missed requirements, and ultimately, a failure to achieve comprehensive compliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of applicable regulations and internal policies. This involves identifying potential compliance risks early in the development process. The next step is to integrate compliance requirements into the project plan and design specifications. Continuous monitoring, testing, and auditing throughout the development lifecycle are crucial. Finally, establishing clear lines of accountability and fostering a culture where compliance is everyone's responsibility ensures that regulatory adherence is maintained proactively and effectively. Question 9. System analysis indicates a need to assess potential cybersecurity risks for a new cloud-based service. Which approach would best fulfill the requirements for a thorough and ethically sound risk assessment? Option A: conducting a broad survey of employees about their perceived security concerns without specific technical data. Option B: gathering threat intelligence from industry-specific reports, consulting with external cybersecurity experts, and analyzing internal vulnerability scan results. Option C: reviewing internal incident logs from the past year and analyzing system performance metrics. Option D: relying solely on general cybersecurity news articles and social media trends to identify prevalent threats. Correct answer is C: reviewing internal incident logs from the past year and analyzing system performance metrics. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in risk assessment, balancing the need for comprehensive data gathering with the practical constraints of time and resources, while also considering the potential for bias in data sources. The professional must identify the most effective and ethically sound method for understanding potential risks without over-relying on incomplete or skewed information. The challenge lies in selecting an approach that is both robust and efficient, adhering to principles of due diligence and responsible risk management. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a multifaceted strategy that combines internal data analysis with external validation and expert consultation. This method represents best professional practice because it acknowledges the limitations of any single data source. Internally, reviewing past incident reports and system logs provides a baseline of known issues. However, Relying solely on this internal data risks overlooking emerging threats or vulnerabilities not yet manifested internally. Supplementing this with industry-specific threat intelligence reports and engaging with cybersecurity experts offers a broader perspective, incorporating external knowledge of evolving attack vectors and best practices. This comprehensive approach ensures a more accurate and actionable risk assessment, aligning with the ethical obligation to protect organizational assets and data through diligent and informed decision-making. It demonstrates a commitment to proactive risk identification and mitigation, which is a cornerstone of responsible information security management. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on internal historical data. This fails to account for the dynamic nature of cybersecurity threats. Regulations and ethical guidelines emphasize the need for proactive and forward-looking risk assessments, not just reactive analysis of past events. This approach risks significant regulatory or ethical failure by creating a false sense of security and leaving the organization vulnerable to novel or sophisticated attacks that have not yet impacted internal systems. Another incorrect approach is to exclusively depend on publicly available threat intelligence without internal context. While public intelligence is valuable, it can be generic and may not accurately reflect the specific vulnerabilities or threat landscape of the organization. This can lead to misallocation of resources, focusing on threats that are not relevant or missing critical internal weaknesses. Ethically, this approach could be seen as insufficient due diligence, failing to adequately understand the unique risk profile of the organization. A third incorrect approach is to prioritize the most frequently reported threats from general news sources. This method is susceptible to sensationalism and may not reflect the actual likelihood or impact of threats relevant to the organization's specific industry or technology stack. It lacks the rigor required for a professional risk assessment and can lead to a distorted understanding of risk, potentially violating professional standards of care and regulatory expectations for a thorough risk evaluation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach risk assessment by first defining the scope and objectives. This involves understanding what assets and processes are being protected. Next, they should identify potential threats and vulnerabilities relevant to the defined scope. The critical step is then to gather information from a diverse range of sources, including internal logs, security audits, industry reports, and expert opinions. This information should be analyzed to determine the likelihood and potential impact of each identified risk. Finally, based on this analysis, mitigation strategies should be developed and prioritized. This systematic and multi-source approach ensures that the risk assessment is comprehensive, accurate, and actionable, fulfilling professional and regulatory obligations. Question 10. Compliance review shows that the team responsible for a critical cloud migration project has proposed a risk assessment strategy that involves documenting every potential minor technical vulnerability identified by automated tools, regardless of its immediate perceived impact, and deferring the assessment of broader operational and strategic risks until after the migration is complete. Which of the following approaches best represents a professionally sound and compliant risk assessment strategy for this cloud migration? Option A. Defer all significant risk assessment activities until after the cloud migration is fully completed, focusing only on immediate technical implementation tasks. Option B. Rely solely on automated scanning tools to identify all potential risks, with minimal human oversight, and assume that any identified issues will be addressed reactively post-migration. Option C. Implement a phased risk assessment that begins with identifying high-level risks across security, operational, and compliance domains, followed by a prioritized deep dive into the most significant risks, and incorporates ongoing risk monitoring throughout the migration lifecycle. Option D. Conduct an exhaustive, granular risk assessment of every conceivable minor technical vulnerability from the outset, documenting each in detail before proceeding with any migration activities. The correct answer is C. Implement a phased risk assessment that begins with identifying high-level risks across security, operational, and compliance domains, followed by a prioritized deep dive into the most significant risks, and incorporates ongoing risk monitoring throughout the migration lifecycle. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for proactive risk identification with the practical constraints of resource allocation and the potential for over-analysis. The team is tasked with assessing risks associated with a new cloud migration, a complex undertaking with inherent uncertainties. The challenge lies in determining the appropriate depth and breadth of the risk assessment, without becoming paralyzed by analysis or overlooking critical vulnerabilities. Effective judgment is required to prioritize risks based on their potential impact and likelihood, ensuring that the assessment is both comprehensive and actionable. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased and iterative risk assessment methodology. This begins with a high-level identification of potential risks across key categories, e.g., security, operational, compliance, financial. Subsequently, these risks are prioritized based on a qualitative assessment of their likelihood and potential impact. The team then focuses deeper analysis on the highest priority risks, developing mitigation strategies and assigning ownership. This approach is best professional practice because it aligns with established risk management frameworks, such as ISO 31000, which emphasize a systematic and proportionate response to risk. It ensures that resources are directed towards the most significant threats, leading to a more efficient and effective risk management process. This iterative nature allows for refinement as more information becomes available during the migration process, reflecting a dynamic and adaptive risk management strategy. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to conduct an exhaustive, granular risk assessment of every conceivable minor risk from the outset. This is professionally unacceptable because it is inefficient, time-consuming, and can lead to analysis paralysis, delaying the project and consuming resources that could be better allocated to mitigation. Fails to adhere to the principle of proportionality in risk management, where efforts should be commensurate with the potential impact of the risk. Another incorrect approach is to solely rely on automated scanning tools without human oversight or contextual understanding. While tools are valuable for identifying known vulnerabilities, they may miss emergent risks, misinterpret findings in the context of the specific cloud environment, or fail to assess the business impact of identified issues. This approach represents a regulatory and ethical failure by neglecting the professional responsibility to conduct a thorough and context-aware assessment, potentially leading to non-compliance with data protection or security regulations due to overlooked risks. A third incorrect approach is to defer all risk assessment to the post-migration phase. This is a critical failure, as it ignores the proactive nature of risk management. Identifying and addressing risks before they materialize is significantly more cost-effective and less disruptive than dealing with incidents after they occur. This approach demonstrates a lack of foresight and a disregard for best practices in IT governance and security, potentially exposing the organization to significant financial and reputational damage, and violating principles of due diligence required by various compliance frameworks. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured risk-based approach to assessment. This involves 1. Defining the scope and objectives of the assessment clearly, 2. Employing a recognized risk management framework, 3. Prioritizing risks based on likelihood and impact, 4. Focusing detailed analysis on high-priority risks, 5. Developing actionable mitigation plans, 6. Establishing a process for ongoing monitoring and review. This systematic process ensures that risk assessment is integrated into the project lifecycle, rather than being an afterthought, and that resources are used effectively to protect the organization. Question 11. Assessment of a new cloud-based service deployment's potential vulnerabilities requires a comprehensive approach. Which of the following best describes the most effective strategy for identifying and prioritizing these risks? Option A. Focusing exclusively on the most publicized and severe cyber attack trends reported in recent industry news to allocate immediate security resources. Option B. Relying on the development team's initial security review and assuming that standard security protocols are sufficient for all potential threats. Option C. Conducting a thorough threat modeling exercise that considers the service's architecture, data flows, and potential attack vectors, followed by a qualitative assessment of the likelihood and impact of identified threats to prioritize mitigation efforts. Option D. Implementing a broad set of security controls across the entire service, without a specific analysis of individual risk factors or their potential impact. The correct answer is C. Conducting a thorough threat modeling exercise that considers the service's architecture, data flows, and potential attack vectors, followed by a qualitative assessment of the likelihood and impact of identified threats to prioritize mitigation efforts. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of risk assessment beyond simple identification. The challenge lies in prioritizing risks based on their potential impact and likelihood, and then determining the most appropriate mitigation strategy within the constraints of a rapidly evolving technological landscape. Microsoft's hiring assessment, particularly in areas like risk assessment, aims to gauge a candidate's ability to apply theoretical knowledge to practical, real-world situations, demonstrating foresight and strategic thinking. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a systematic and documented process of risk assessment. This includes identifying potential threats, analyzing their likelihood and impact, and then developing a response plan. This aligns with established cybersecurity frameworks and best practices, emphasizing a proactive rather than reactive stance. Such a structured approach ensures that resources are allocated effectively to address the most critical risks, thereby safeguarding the organization's assets and reputation. This methodical process is often a requirement or strong recommendation within industry standards and regulatory guidelines that Microsoft's assessment would implicitly draw upon, focusing on due diligence and responsible risk management. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate, high-profile threats without considering their likelihood or potential long-term impact would be professionally unacceptable. This oversight could lead to misallocation of resources, leaving the organization vulnerable to less obvious but potentially more damaging risks. Ethically, it represents a failure to exercise due diligence and a lack of comprehensive risk management. Another incorrect approach, such as relying on anecdotal evidence or gut feelings rather than data-driven analysis, would also be professionally unsound. This lacks the rigor and objectivity required for effective risk assessment and could lead to biased decision-making, failing to meet the standards of professional conduct expected in a technology-driven environment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This typically includes 1. Risk identification, brainstorming and documenting all potential risks. 2. Risk analysis, evaluating the likelihood and impact of each identified risk. 3. Risk evaluation, prioritizing risks based on the analysis. 4. Risk treatment, developing and implementing strategies to mitigate, transfer, avoid, or accept risks. 5. Risk monitoring and review, continuously tracking risks and the effectiveness of mitigation strategies. This iterative process ensures that risk management remains dynamic and responsive to changing circumstances. Question 12. Comparative studies suggest that when assessing the potential impact of emerging technologies on a company's cybersecurity posture, which approach best balances proactive risk identification with the need for actionable mitigation strategies. Option A. Relying primarily on historical cybersecurity incident data to identify recurring threats and allocate resources to address those specific vulnerabilities. Option B. Implementing a comprehensive, scenario-based risk assessment that incorporates expert judgment, threat intelligence feeds, and simulations of potential future attack vectors, followed by the development of adaptive control measures. Option C. Conducting a superficial review of industry best practices without a detailed analysis of how these practices apply to the company's unique technological environment and risk profile. Option D. Prioritizing the immediate implementation of cost-saving measures in IT infrastructure, assuming that current security protocols are sufficient for foreseeable threats. The correct answer is B. Implementing a comprehensive, scenario-based risk assessment that incorporates expert judgment, threat intelligence feeds, and simulations of potential future attack vectors, followed by the development of adaptive control measures. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent uncertainty in predicting the impact of emerging technological risks on a company's operations and financial stability. The need to balance proactive risk mitigation with resource allocation requires careful judgment. The challenge is amplified by the rapid pace of technological change, making traditional risk assessment models potentially insufficient. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it emphasizes a structured, iterative, and forward-looking methodology for risk assessment. It aligns with the principles of robust risk management frameworks, which advocate for identifying potential threats, assessing their likelihood and impact, and developing appropriate response strategies. This proactive stance helps in anticipating and mitigating future risks, thereby safeguarding the organization's assets and reputation. It also reflects a commitment to continuous improvement and adaptation in the face of evolving threats, a key tenet of effective governance and compliance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on historical data fails to account for novel risks introduced by new technologies. This oversight can lead to a false sense of security and leave the organization vulnerable to unforeseen events, violating the ethical duty to exercise due diligence in risk management. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate financial gains over risk mitigation ignores the potential for catastrophic losses that can arise from unaddressed technological risks. This demonstrates a failure to uphold fiduciary responsibilities and a disregard for the long-term sustainability of the business, potentially breaching regulatory expectations for prudent management. A third incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or expert opinion without a systematic framework lacks the rigor required for effective risk assessment. This can lead to biased conclusions and an incomplete understanding of the risk landscape, undermining the credibility of the risk management process and potentially failing to meet compliance standards that require evidence-based decision-making. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the organization's strategic objectives and risk appetite. This involves systematically identifying potential risks, including those associated with emerging technologies, through a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. The next step is to analyze the likelihood and potential impact of these risks, considering both direct and indirect consequences. Based on this analysis, appropriate mitigation strategies should be developed and implemented, with a focus on cost-effectiveness and alignment with the organization's risk tolerance. Finally, a process of continuous monitoring, review, and adaptation is crucial to ensure that the risk management framework remains effective in a dynamic environment. Question 13. Market research demonstrates a growing demand for personalized user experiences powered by advanced AI. A development team is proposing to integrate a new, experimental AI model into a core product. While the model promises significant improvements in personalization, its behavior in edge cases and its potential for unintended biases are not fully understood. The team is under pressure to release this feature quickly to capture market share. What is the most appropriate approach to managing the risks associated with this new AI integration? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment, including identification, analysis of likelihood and impact, and development of targeted mitigation strategies for potential biases, privacy concerns, and performance issues before proceeding with the launch. Option B. Prioritize the mitigation of risks that are easiest to address technically, even if more complex or potentially severe risks remain unaddressed, to ensure a timely release. Option C. Perform a quick, informal review of potential risks by the lead developer, focusing only on the most obvious technical challenges, and then proceed with the launch. Option D. Proceed with the launch of the AI feature immediately, as market demand is high, and address any identified issues post-launch through iterative updates. Correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment, including identification, analysis of likelihood and impact, and development of targeted mitigation strategies for potential biases, privacy concerns, and performance issues before proceeding with the launch. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of risk assessment beyond simple identification. The challenge lies in prioritizing risks based on their potential impact and likelihood, and then determining the most appropriate mitigation strategy within a defined regulatory and ethical framework. The pressure to deliver a new feature quickly, coupled with the inherent uncertainties of a novel technology, necessitates careful judgment to balance innovation with responsible risk management. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process of risk assessment. This begins with identifying potential risks associated with the new AI feature, such as data privacy breaches, algorithmic bias, or performance degradation. Subsequently, each identified risk must be analyzed to determine its likelihood of occurrence and potential impact on users, the company, and its reputation. Based on this analysis, risks are prioritized. The most effective mitigation strategy is then selected, which could involve implementing technical safeguards, developing robust testing protocols, establishing clear user guidelines, or even deciding to defer certain functionalities if the risk is deemed unacceptably high. This structured approach aligns with best professional practices and regulatory expectations for responsible AI development, emphasizing proactive risk management and due diligence. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the feature launch without a formal risk assessment, relying solely on the development team's intuition. This represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It bypasses established risk management protocols, potentially exposing the company to legal liabilities, reputational damage, and harm to users. Such an approach demonstrates a disregard for due diligence and a failure to comply with implicit or explicit requirements for responsible innovation. Another incorrect approach is to conduct a superficial risk assessment that only identifies obvious risks, but fails to analyze their likelihood or impact. This is also professionally unacceptable, as it leads to an incomplete understanding of the risk landscape. Without proper analysis, mitigation strategies will be ineffective, leaving critical vulnerabilities unaddressed. This can be seen as a failure to meet the standard of care expected in professional risk management. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on mitigating risks that are easy to address, while ignoring more complex or potentially severe risks. This selective mitigation is a failure of professional responsibility. It prioritizes expediency over thoroughness and can lead to significant unforeseen consequences. Ethically, it is a dereliction of duty to protect stakeholders from potential harm. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes a structured and documented risk assessment process. This framework should include 1. Comprehensive risk identification, 2. Thorough risk analysis, likelihood and impact, 3. Risk prioritization, and 4. Selection and implementation of appropriate mitigation strategies. This process should be iterative and involve cross-functional collaboration. When faced with novel technologies or tight deadlines, it is crucial to resist the temptation to cut corners on risk assessment. Instead, professionals should advocate for adequate time and resources to conduct a robust evaluation, ensuring that decisions are informed by a clear understanding of potential risks and their consequences. This proactive and systematic approach is fundamental to ethical and compliant professional practice. Question 14. To address the challenge of ensuring robust data protection and operational resilience, a technology company is conducting a risk assessment for its cloud-based services. The assessment has identified several potential risks, including data breaches due to unpatched vulnerabilities, service disruptions caused by denial-of-service attacks, and reputational damage from customer data misuse. Which of the following approaches best represents a comprehensive and effective risk assessment strategy? Option A. Focusing on mitigating risks that are easiest to address technically, irrespective of their potential impact or likelihood. Option B. Prioritizing mitigation efforts based on the potential impact of each risk and the likelihood of its occurrence, then developing tailored response plans. Option C. Addressing only those risks that have a high probability of occurring, even if their potential impact is minor. Option D. Implementing extensive security controls for every identified risk, regardless of its probability or severity. The correct answer is B. Prioritizing mitigation efforts based on the potential impact of each risk and the likelihood of its occurrence, then developing tailored response plans. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of risk assessment beyond simple identification. The challenge lies in prioritizing risks based on their potential impact and likelihood, and then determining the most appropriate mitigation strategies within a given regulatory context. A superficial approach could lead to misallocation of resources, failure to address critical vulnerabilities, and potential noncompliance. Careful judgment is required to balance proactive risk management with operational efficiency. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic process of identifying potential risks, assessing their likelihood and impact, and then developing proportionate responses. This aligns with best professional practices in risk management, which emphasize a structured and evidence-based methodology. By focusing on the most significant risks first, resources are directed effectively, maximizing the protection of assets and operations. This proactive stance is often implicitly or explicitly encouraged by regulatory frameworks that aim to ensure the stability and integrity of systems and data. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to focus solely on risks that are easiest to mitigate, regardless of their potential impact. This fails to address the most critical threats and could lead to significant losses if a high-impact, low-mitigation effort risk materializes. Ethically, this represents a failure of due diligence and a disregard for the organization's overall security posture. Another incorrect approach would be to overinvest in mitigating every identified risk, even those with negligible likelihood or impact. This is inefficient and can divert resources from more pressing concerns. From a regulatory perspective, while thoroughness is valued, an unproportionate allocation of resources can be seen as poor governance and a failure to manage risk effectively. A third incorrect approach would be to ignore risks that are perceived as unlikely, even if their potential impact is catastrophic. This is a critical failure in risk assessment, as it leaves the organization exposed to potentially devastating events. This approach demonstrates a lack of foresight and a failure to uphold professional responsibility to protect the organization's interests. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a risk assessment framework that includes identification, analysis, likelihood and impact, evaluation and treatment. This process should be iterative and informed by the specific context of the organization, its assets, and the prevailing regulatory environment. Decision-making should prioritize risks based on their potential to cause harm, ensuring that mitigation efforts are proportionate and effective. Continuous monitoring and review are essential to adapt to evolving threat landscapes. Question 15. Process analysis reveals that a new feature for a critical business application is nearing its planned release date, and the development team is eager to deploy it to meet market demands. However, the formal risk assessment process, which typically involves security reviews, compliance checks, and operational impact analysis, has been significantly condensed due to time constraints. The team proposes to proceed with the release and conduct a more thorough risk assessment post-deployment, relying on automated vulnerability scans and user feedback to identify any issues. Which of the following represents the most professionally sound approach to managing the risks associated with this accelerated release? Option A. Delay the release until a comprehensive risk assessment, including security, compliance, and operational impact analysis, is completed and all identified high-priority risks are mitigated. Option B. Proceed with the release as planned, relying on post-deployment automated vulnerability scans and user feedback to identify and address risks. Option C. Delegate the full responsibility of risk assessment to the development team, trusting their judgment to identify and address potential issues during the accelerated development cycle. Option D. Release the feature immediately and initiate a condensed risk assessment process that focuses only on critical security vulnerabilities, deferring other risk types. Correct answer is A. Delay the release until a comprehensive risk assessment, including security, compliance, and operational impact analysis, is completed and all identified high-priority risks are mitigated. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for rapid innovation and product deployment with the imperative to conduct thorough risk assessments. The pressure to release new features quickly can lead to shortcuts in the risk assessment process, potentially exposing the organization to significant operational, security, or compliance risks. Careful judgment is required to ensure that risk assessment is integrated into the development lifecycle, rather than being an afterthought. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it embeds risk assessment as a continuous and iterative process throughout the software development lifecycle, SDLC. This aligns with established cybersecurity frameworks and best practices, which emphasize proactive risk identification and mitigation. By integrating risk assessment from the initial design phase through deployment and ongoing maintenance, potential vulnerabilities are identified and addressed early, when they are less costly and disruptive to fix. This proactive stance minimizes the likelihood of security breaches, data loss, and regulatory noncompliance, thereby protecting the organization's reputation and financial stability. It also ensures that the organization can demonstrate due diligence in its risk management efforts, which is often a requirement under various regulatory regimes. An incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate deployment over a comprehensive risk assessment fails to adequately identify and mitigate potential threats. This could lead to the introduction of exploitable vulnerabilities, data breaches, or system failures, resulting in significant financial losses, reputational damage, and potential legal liabilities. Such an approach demonstrates a disregard for established risk management principles and could be seen as a failure to uphold professional duty of care. Another incorrect approach that relies solely on post-deployment vulnerability scanning is insufficient. While valuable, this method is reactive and only identifies risks after they have been introduced into the production environment. This increases the likelihood of exploitation before detection and remediation, and it misses risks that may not be detectable through scanning alone, such as design flaws or policy violations. A third incorrect approach that delegates risk assessment entirely to the development team without specialized oversight or a defined process is also problematic. While developers are crucial in identifying technical risks, they may lack the broader perspective or expertise to assess all potential risks, including compliance, legal, and strategic risks. This can lead to an incomplete or biased risk assessment, leaving critical vulnerabilities unaddressed. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk management framework. This framework should define clear roles and responsibilities, establish a methodology for risk identification, analysis, evaluation, and treatment, and ensure that risk assessment is an integral part of all project phases. Professionals should advocate for sufficient time and resources to be allocated for risk assessment activities and ensure that findings are communicated effectively to stakeholders, with clear action plans for mitigation. When faced with pressure to compromise on risk assessment, professionals should escalate concerns through appropriate channels, citing potential consequences and regulatory implications. Question 16. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a new AI-powered customer service chatbot could significantly reduce operational expenses. However, preliminary reviews indicate a potential for the chatbot to exhibit biases in its responses based on the training data, and the proposed data handling protocols for user interactions are not yet fully compliant with GDPR, which approach best balances efficiency gains with responsible technology deployment. Option A. Deploy the chatbot immediately to capture cost savings, with a plan to address any identified biases or privacy issues post-launch as they arise. Option B. Implement the chatbot with a disclaimer that its responses may contain biases and that user data is handled according to current internal policies, deferring extensive compliance efforts to a later stage. Option C. Halt the project until all potential biases are completely eliminated and full GDPR compliance is independently certified, even if it means significant delays and foregoing immediate cost benefits. Option D. Proceed with a phased rollout of the chatbot, prioritizing continuous monitoring for bias and implementing necessary data privacy adjustments in parallel with user feedback. The correct answer is D. Proceed with a phased rollout of the chatbot, prioritizing continuous monitoring for bias and implementing necessary data privacy adjustments in parallel with user feedback. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the potential benefits of a new technology with the inherent risks and compliance obligations. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that the adoption of this technology aligns with Microsoft's commitment to responsible AI development and deployment, as well as adhering to relevant data privacy and security regulations. Careful judgment is required to avoid unintended consequences and maintain stakeholder trust. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, multifaceted evaluation before full implementation. This includes rigorous testing for bias, ensuring data privacy compliance, and establishing clear governance frameworks. This aligns with Microsoft's stated principles for responsible AI, which emphasize fairness, reliability, safety, privacy, security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. By proactively addressing these aspects, the company mitigates risks and builds a foundation for ethical and effective AI use, which is a key regulatory and ethical expectation in the technology sector. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the potential cost savings without adequately assessing the risks of bias would fail to meet ethical standards and could lead to discriminatory outcomes, violating principles of fairness and inclusivity. This also poses a significant regulatory risk, as many jurisdictions are developing or have enacted laws against algorithmic discrimination. Another incorrect approach that bypasses comprehensive security audits in favor of rapid deployment would expose sensitive user data to breaches, violating privacy and security regulations and eroding customer trust. Furthermore, an approach that neglects to establish clear accountability mechanisms for AI outputs would create a governance vacuum, making it difficult to address errors or misuse, and potentially contravening emerging AI governance frameworks that demand transparency and accountability. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the problem and objectives. This should be followed by a comprehensive risk assessment, considering technical, ethical, and regulatory dimensions, evaluating potential solutions against established best practices and ethical guidelines, such as those for responsible AI, is crucial. Finally, a phased implementation with continuous monitoring and feedback loops allows for adaptive management and ensures that the chosen approach remains aligned with evolving requirements and societal expectations. Question 17. Process analysis reveals a critical need to accelerate the delivery of a highly anticipated new feature. The development team is under significant pressure to release this feature to the entire user base within the next sprint. However, the proposed development plan has omitted dedicated user acceptance testing, UAT, and a phased rollout strategy, opting instead for a direct, immediate deployment after internal developer testing. Which of the following approaches best represents professional best practice in this scenario? Option A. Proceed with the direct, immediate deployment to the entire user base as planned, relying on internal developer testing to catch any critical issues. Option B. Implement a phased rollout strategy, starting with a small segment of users, and incorporate user acceptance testing, UAT, before a wider release, even if it requires a slight adjustment to the sprint timeline. Option C. Conduct only internal developer testing, and then deploy directly to all users, assuming that the feature's perceived value will outweigh any minor initial bugs. Option D. Prioritize the immediate release to the entire user base and address any user-reported issues reactively as they arise. The correct answer is B. Implement a phased rollout strategy, starting with a small segment of users, and incorporate user acceptance testing, UAT, before a wider release, even if it requires a slight adjustment to the sprint timeline. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge in balancing the need for rapid innovation with the imperative of adhering to established best practices for software development lifecycle management. The pressure to deliver a new feature quickly can tempt teams to bypass crucial validation steps, potentially leading to technical debt, security vulnerabilities, or a product that doesn't meet user needs. Careful judgment is required to ensure that speed does not compromise quality or compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured and iterative development process that includes essential quality assurance and user feedback loops. This aligns with industry-standard best practices for software development, such as agile methodologies, which emphasize continuous integration, testing, and feedback. By incorporating user acceptance testing, UAT, and a phased rollout, the team ensures that the feature is not only technically sound, but also meets actual user requirements and can be deployed without major disruption. This proactive approach minimizes risks and maximizes the likelihood of successful adoption. An incorrect approach that bypasses user acceptance testing and deploys directly to all users without a phased rollout fails to validate the feature against real-world usage. This can lead to significant user dissatisfaction, increased support costs, and potential reputational damage if critical bugs are discovered post-deployment. Ethically, it breaches the implicit trust users place in the product to function as expected. Another incorrect approach that skips comprehensive security testing before deployment poses a severe risk. In today's digital landscape, security vulnerabilities can have devastating consequences, including data breaches, financial losses, and legal liabilities. Failing to conduct thorough security testing is a direct violation of professional responsibility to protect user data and maintain system integrity. An incorrect approach that relies solely on internal developer testing without any form of external validation or user feedback overlooks the inherent biases and limited perspectives within the development team. While internal testing is vital, it cannot fully replicate the diverse ways users interact with a product. This can result in a feature that is technically functional but unintuitive or unhelpful to the target audience, representing a failure in understanding and meeting user needs. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a risk-based assessment of each development stage. Teams should ask, what are the potential consequences of skipping this step? What is the likelihood of those consequences occurring? What is the impact on the user, the business, and the product's reputation? This framework encourages a proactive rather than reactive stance, ensuring that critical quality and validation gates are maintained, even under pressure to accelerate delivery. Prioritizing user value and system integrity over arbitrary deadlines is a hallmark of professional software development. Question 18. Consider a scenario where a software development team requires realistic data for testing a new feature. The most accurate and representative data for this purpose is currently residing in the production environment, which contains sensitive customer information. What is the most professionally responsible approach to obtaining and using this data for testing? Option A. Generate entirely synthetic data that mimics the structure of production data but contains no real customer information. Option B. Use a direct copy of the production data in the testing environment without any modifications, assuming the testing environment is sufficiently secure. Option C. Transfer a direct copy of the production data to the testing environment, relying on team members' verbal assurances to handle it with care. Option D. Anonymize or pseudonymize the production data to remove or obscure personally identifiable information before transferring it to the testing environment. Correct answer is D. Anonymize or pseudonymize the production data to remove or obscure personally identifiable information before transferring it to the testing environment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to data privacy and compliance within a software development context. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for realistic testing data with the legal and ethical obligations to protect personally identifiable information, PI. Mismanagement of this data can lead to severe regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and loss of customer trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all development and testing activities adhere to the relevant data protection laws. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves anonymizing or pseudonymizing the data before it is used in the testing environment. Anonymization irrevocably removes or obscures PII, rendering the data non-identifiable. Pseudonymization replaces direct identifiers with artificial ones, allowing for re-identification under specific controlled conditions. This method aligns with best practices for data protection, as it significantly reduces the risk of unauthorized access or disclosure of sensitive information. It directly addresses the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation, ensuring that data is handled responsibly and in accordance with privacy regulations. This approach demonstrates a commitment to safeguarding user privacy while still enabling effective software development and testing. Incorrect approaches analysis. Using a direct copy of production data without any modification poses a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach directly violates data protection principles by exposing sensitive PII to a less secure environment, increasing the risk of data breaches. It fails to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect personal data, which is a fundamental requirement under most data privacy frameworks. Another incorrect approach involves relying solely on verbal assurances from team members that they will be careful with the data. This is insufficient as it lacks concrete technical safeguards and accountability mechanisms. Verbal assurances do not constitute a robust compliance strategy and leave the organization vulnerable to accidental or intentional misuse of data. Finally, generating entirely synthetic data that does not accurately reflect the complexity or distribution of real-world data can lead to ineffective testing and potentially flawed software. While it avoids PII risks, it compromises the quality and reliability of the testing process, which can indirectly impact user experience and data integrity in the production environment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach to data handling. This involves identifying sensitive data, assessing the risks associated with its use in different environments, and implementing appropriate controls. A robust data governance framework, including clear policies and procedures for data anonymization, pseudonymization, and secure handling, is essential. Regular training for development and testing teams on data privacy, best practices, and relevant regulations is also critical. When in doubt, consulting with legal and compliance experts is a prudent step to ensure adherence to all applicable laws and ethical standards. Question 19. The investigation demonstrates that a critical new feature is nearing its scheduled release date, but the security team has identified several potential vulnerabilities during a late-stage review. The development team believes these vulnerabilities are low risk and can be addressed in a subsequent patch, arguing that delaying the release will cause significant business impact and allow competitors to gain market share. Option A. Halt the release immediately and conduct a full, in-depth security audit, delaying the launch until all identified vulnerabilities are fully remediated and verified. Option B. Deploy the feature with a disclaimer acknowledging potential security risks and rely on user reports to identify and address issues. Option C. Proceed with the release as planned, documenting the identified vulnerabilities and committing to a post-release patch within a defined timeframe. Option D. Prioritize the release of the feature and address the identified vulnerabilities through a phased approach, integrating fixes into future development cycles as resources allow. Correct answer is C. Proceed with the release as planned, documenting the identified vulnerabilities and committing to a post-release patch within a defined timeframe. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in balancing the need for rapid innovation and product development with the imperative to maintain robust security and privacy controls. The pressure to release a new feature quickly can lead to shortcuts in security testing, potentially exposing user data or system integrity to risks. The core challenge lies in making informed decisions under time constraints while adhering to established best practices and regulatory expectations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a thorough security review and risk assessment before the feature is deployed. This aligns with the principle of security by design and privacy by design, which are foundational to responsible technology development. In the context of Microsoft's operational framework and general data protection principles, this proactive stance ensures that potential vulnerabilities are identified and mitigated early in the development lifecycle. This approach minimizes the likelihood of data breaches, regulatory noncompliance, e.g., with GDPR or similar privacy laws that Microsoft operates under globally, and reputational damage. It demonstrates a commitment to user trust and data stewardship, which are paramount in the tech industry. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the deployment without a comprehensive security review, relying solely on the development team's self-assessment. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It violates the principle of due diligence, which requires organizations to take reasonable steps to protect data and systems. Such an approach increases the risk of data breaches, leading to potential fines under data protection regulations and loss of customer trust. Ethically, it prioritizes speed over the safety and privacy of users. Another incorrect approach is to delay the deployment indefinitely due to minor, unquantified security concerns raised late in the process. While security is critical, an indefinite delay without a clear path to resolution or risk acceptance is professionally inefficient and can stifle innovation. This approach fails to apply a risk-based methodology, which is a cornerstone of effective security management. It can lead to missed market opportunities and a perception of an overly risk-averse culture, hindering progress. A third incorrect approach is to implement a patch-later strategy, deploying the feature with known, albeit minor, security issues and planning to address them post-launch. This is a direct contravention of best practices in secure software development. It exposes users and the system to unnecessary risks during the period between deployment and the patch. This approach is ethically questionable as it knowingly introduces vulnerabilities and is likely to be viewed unfavorably by regulatory bodies overseeing data security and privacy. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based decision-making framework. This involves 1. Identifying potential risks, security, privacy, operational. 2. Assessing the likelihood and impact of each risk. 3. Evaluating mitigation strategies and their feasibility. 4. Making a decision based on the risk assessment, considering regulatory requirements, ethical obligations, and business objectives. In situations with competing priorities, a structured risk assessment provides an objective basis for decision-making, ensuring that trade-offs are made consciously and with a clear understanding of the potential consequences. Question 20. Upon reviewing the candidate assessment process for a new role at Microsoft, you notice that the current system automatically collects a broad range of personal information from applicants, including social media profiles and publicly available background check data, even before the candidate has formally agreed to the assessment's terms and conditions. What is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with data privacy best practices? Option A. Proceed with the data collection but add a disclaimer to the assessment explaining the types of data being collected and the potential uses, without requiring explicit consent. Option B. Share the collected personal data with third-party recruitment analytics firms to improve the assessment process, as this is a common industry practice. Option C. Immediately halt the collection of all personal data until a clear consent mechanism is implemented, and revise the assessment to collect only essential information required for evaluation. Option D. Continue the current data collection process, assuming that by applying for the role, candidates implicitly consent to the collection of all available personal data. Correct answer is C. Immediately halt the collection of all personal data until a clear consent mechanism is implemented, and revise the assessment to collect only essential information required for evaluation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to data privacy and compliance within the context of a Microsoft hiring assessment. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for thorough candidate evaluation with the imperative to adhere to strict data protection regulations, specifically those governing the handling of personal information. The assessment aims to gauge a candidate's understanding of best practices in this area, ensuring they can operate ethically and legally within a corporate environment. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing candidate consent and data minimization. This aligns with the principles of data protection laws, which mandate that personal data should only be collected and processed with the explicit consent of the individual and only for specified, legitimate purposes. By seeking consent before collecting sensitive information and limiting the scope of data collected to what is strictly necessary for the assessment, the candidate upholds the highest ethical and regulatory standards. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of data breaches and fosters trust with potential employees. An incorrect approach that involves collecting extensive personal data without explicit consent represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This violates fundamental data protection principles, potentially leading to legal penalties and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, such as sharing candidate data with third parties without proper authorization or a clear legal basis, also constitutes a serious breach of trust and regulatory noncompliance. Furthermore, retaining candidate data for longer than necessary without a legitimate business purpose or a defined retention policy is another common pitfall that can lead to compliance issues. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the specific data protection regulations applicable to the situation. This involves understanding the types of data being handled, the purpose of its collection, and the rights of the data subjects. The next step is to assess the necessity and proportionality of data collection, ensuring that only the minimum amount of data required for the stated purpose is gathered. Obtaining informed consent from individuals is paramount, clearly outlining what data will be collected, how it will be used, and for how long it will be retained. Finally, implementing robust security measures and clear data retention policies are crucial to maintaining compliance and protecting personal information.